So in this first section regarding H. pylori infection, we'll be studying about the pathogenesis of the H. pylori infection. In this section, we'll be starting with the epidemiology, and then what are the different things that are involved in the pathogenesis, such as the bacterial colonization and the different virulence factors that are involved in pathogenesis, and then what are the response of the host in return to this infection, and then what are the different types of conditions and associated diseases with regard to H. pylori infection. So, H. pylori infection is the most common chronic infection in humans and in the world. Over 50% of the world's population is infected with this bacterium, around 70 to 80% in the developing countries. This infection is usually acquired at an early age in childhood, around by the age of 10, and it's mostly involved in developing countries. So, children are the most prone to acquiring H. pylori infection. The new adult infection is usually uncommon and is estimated to occur in around less than 0.5% cases per year. So it's very less common in adults, but it's more common in children. In the USA, regarding to any age group, it is usually more common in non-whites. For example, in whites, the percentage is around 27%. In African Americans, the percentage is around 51%, and in Hispanics, 58%. This infection goes back to around 58,000 years ago. Humans were also infected with H. pylori infection, and it was first present in Africa, and these Africans, when they migrated to different parts of the world, H. pylori infection got transmitted to different parts of the world. So humans appear to be the major reservoir of H. pylori infection, residing in the lumen of the gastric stomach. Contaminated water also acts as an environmental source of H. pylori infection. The transmission, to be precise, does not have any relation to any other individual, but the transmission is usually suggested by person to person or gastro-oral, fecal-oral, or usually oral to oral exposure. So the importance of childhood socioeconomic status is very important because this infection usually resides in the children at a very young age. So housing density, crowded conditions in the home, number of siblings, sharing a bed, living conditions, and lack of hot or running water, these are all factors that contribute to the risk factors of H. pylori infection. So coming to the pathogenesis, H. pylori infection is a very unique bacteria that is associated with so many diseases, and this H. pylori infection cannot really fully explain how is this infection related to so many chronic diseases. So the pathogenesis of H. pylori infection is has two factors, that is the bacterial colonization and different virulence factors, and the response of the host in regard to H. pylori infection. So in relation to the pH, the most important is the exposure of the bacterium to low pH increases its expression of gene encoding protein, which helps in its motility, and the other expression is the gene urease that helps the bacteria in residing in the gastric lumen. So urease, how does it help? Urease helps the HP retain optimal function at two different types of pH, which is 7.2 and 3.34. So what does urease really do is that it converts the urea into ammonia and carbon dioxide, and thus it magnifies the pH and it neutralizes the pH, helping the Helicobacter pylori infection to completely reside and adjust to the environment of the gastric lumen. The HP, with the help of the flagella, the multiple flagella at the one pole of its body, helps it to migrate to below the mucus layer, and where secretions of urea helps maintain a neutral pH. For example, in this diagram, H. pylori infection damages the protective mucus layer. This mucus layer is a gel-like, it has a gel-like consistency, and then when this urease converts the urea into ammonia and carbon dioxide, it converts this mucus layer into a more solution-like consistency. So the bacteria colonizes the stomach mucosa, and acid passes through the weakened mucosal layer, causing an ulcer. As the gel-like consistency is now transformed into a solution-like consistency, and it cannot really protect the mucosal layer, and thus acid can easily damage the mucosal layer. Other than the bacterial colonization, there's an expression of receptors that is very important in the pathogenicity of H. pylori infection. These expressions of receptors on the host cells that allow the Helicobacter pylori to completely bind to the epithelial cells of the gastric lumen. These receptors, there are different types of receptors. The receptors include, for example, Lewis-LE antigen, which is expressed from the gastric epithelium and allows the Helicobacter pylori infection to completely bind to the gastric epithelium. Another type of Lewis antigen is the Lewis B type, which is also called as LEB. And then there's a different class 2 HLA genes, which are also expressed by the epithelial cells of the gastric mucosal layer, which helps in binding with the H. pylori infection. There's another class 2 called molecular HC cells, which are the first epithelial cells, which almost were the first epithelial cells to help the H. pylori infection to bind to the epithelial cells and send signals to the host cells and make them work as they want. And then there are different types of PAM cells, which are pathogen-associated molecular cells. And then there are the TLR cells, which are also present within the epithelial surface of the gastric epithelium. And then there are the trefoil protein TFF1. And then there's a specific CAG pathogenicity island sort of gene cells present on the epithelial cells, which are a form of the bacteria itself, which is a form of the bacteria DNA, and thus produces an interaction between the H. pylori and the epithelial cells. And lastly, there are the vacuolating genes that also help in binding the H. pylori infection with the epithelial cells. So after this H. pylori infection migrates to the gastric epithelium, it completely attaches to the host cells, that are the epithelial cells, and then may damage them in order to obtain nutrients from the inflammatory exudate or exudate. So in this picture, this is an H. pylori infection, which comes close to the gastric mucin gastric mucin gel. So HCl in the stomach is usually lower because it's more acidic. It has a more acidic environment, so it has a lower pH, which is the gastric mucin forming the gel. So H. pylori urease, like I've mentioned before, it hydrolyzes the urea into ammonia and carbon dioxide, which neutralizes the HCl and produces a very comfortable environment for the H. pylori infection, increasing the pH. So this mucin transition from the gel into solution causes a decrease in elasticity and exposes the gastric epithelial cells and helps the H. pylori to colonize around the epithelial cells. So this H. pylori swims freely through the mucus and attaches completely to the epithelial cells, and thus gives more way to other H. pylori bacteria to come and colonize around this epithelial cells. So the second part regarding the pathogenicity of H. pylori infection, the very important part is that is the host response of the epithelial cells to the infection, which is a very intrinsic component of the pathogenesis of gastrointestinal disease. It usually plays a very direct role in the production and the development of gastric cancer. And polymorphism is also associated with IL-1 beta, which helps in the association with hypochlorhydria and gastric cancer. So there are different types of genes that regulate the inflammatory response, such as the IL-10, such as TNF-alpha and IL-8. So these genes, what do? Is that they help in producing a sequence of events that could lead to the development of gastric cancer. So their gastric epithelial cells, they usually play a very important integral part in the host response. So this response could be affected by variable factors. For example, the factors such as bacterial virulence factors and the local environment of genes and hormones such as hormones, neurotransmitters, immune or inflammatory cytokines, the mediators, and the stromal factors. And other than that, the response of the epithelial cell in response to this infection is listed as the changes in the morphology of the epithelial cells. And then the disruption of the tight junctional complexes such as the proteins cadherin, which help in producing a tight junction between the epithelial cells, and then the production of cytokines, which causes inflammation. Other than that, the increased proliferation of the cells and the enhanced cell death via apoptosis. Like we've mentioned before, apoptosis causes cell death or suicide of the cell. And then lastly, it causes the induction of numerous genes within the epithelial cells. So the response of the infection is that a very direct inflammation occurs within the epithelial cells, causing numerous macrophages and phagocytes and cytokines to arrive at the location of the injury. So, for example, in this first picture, we see that this is the gastric fluid. This is the mucus layer, which is usually gel-like in consistency, and then the epithelial cells. So the H. pylori infection slightly goes through the mucosal layer and reaches the epithelial cells. So this is a zoomed in picture in which the H. pylori, what does it exactly do is that it produces urease, which hydrolyzes the urea into carbon dioxide and ammonia, which usually neutralizes the hydrochloric acid, which has a lower pH, and neutralizes it into increasing the pH and neutralizes the whole environment and helps the H. pylori infection to reside. And in response to this, when the environment is very suitable, there are a colony of H. pylori infection comes and resides within the surface of the epithelial cells. And lastly, the mucosal damage. As the pH has been increased, bacteria are more prone to damaging the epithelial cells. So mucosal damage occurs by the bacterial mucinase, and inflammation occurs. Lastly, phagocytosis occurs, and different types of cytokines are released. Inflammation by the gastric acid and proteases and other affected molecules. And lastly, the mucosal cell death occurs because of this grave damage to the mucosal cell layer. So there are different conditions that arise with the help of this infection. These are listed as the chronic active gastritis, peptic ulcer disease, which is a very common disease that occurs in mostly almost 1 in 3 individuals. Gastric adenocarcinoma, as like I've mentioned before, the host response can also lead to factors that could develop a gastric carcinoma, and then gastric lymphoma, which is also called as melanoma. So, like we mentioned that the pH of the acid is usually low. So when there's a normal gastric mucosa, with the acute H. pylori infection, it usually, with the passage of years, it converts into a chronic H. pylori infection. And there are different types of diseases related to chronic H. pylori infection, such as the antral predominant gastritis, and then the non-atrophic pan gastritis, corpus predominant gastritis, and then in regard to this, it further leads into different gastrointestinal diseases such as the duodenal ulcer, the malt lymphoma, H. pylori infection that could be asymptomatic, different type of gastric ulcers, and most deadly disease such as the intestinal metaplasia, slowly converting into dysplasia and finally developing a gastric cancer. So these conditions that arises from this infection leads to different types of mechanism that completely involves the production of these different types of diseases, such as interaction between the abnormal infection and the host proteins and interaction, and then the damage to the mucosal cell layer, which slightly uh, damages more and then leads to gastric cancer. There are other kinds of conditions that are related to H. pylori infection. These are listed as Raynaud's phenomenon, which is also known as the hot or cold hands, which the hands, they slightly turn a little bluish when in response to any cold environment. Scleroderma, which is also an autoimmune disease. Idiopathic urticaria. Acne rosacea. Migraines. Thyroiditis. So these are the different types of conditions that are other than the gastrointestinal diseases that could also develop because of the infection called as H. pylori infection. So this is all from this section regarding H. pylori infection and the pathogenesis. Uh, Keep watching the other sections related to this lecture. Thank you for watching sqadia.com.